Hello and welcome to the University of London and to the Institute of Education. I am Professor Gerald Grace and I am the Director for the Centre for Research and Development in Catholic Education here at the Institute of Education. And I am very pleased to have been invited by your university to present two lectures on the theme Professional Ethics. In this lecture, I will be examining the nature of and the need for professional ethics in the world of international business, trade, finance, and banking. In order to do this, we must first understand what a profession and the concept of professionalism actually means. And to do that, we have to look at some of the history relating to the development of the ideas of professionalism as they evolved in Europe from the Middle Ages to this present age of global marketization. Now, I know that as modern students living in the modern age, you will be thinking, why do we need to know about the history? It is yesterday's story. We want to hear about today's story. I understand your impatience. Even I was once a young man. However, you have to set aside this impatience. We need to know history, some history, because it is impossible to understand today's story without some knowledge of the historical process by which it has come about. I will therefore use as one of my major sources the classic study of professions and professionalism written by the French sociologist Émile Durkheim in the 19th century, a book entitled Professional Ethics and Civic Morals. I will also use, to understand our present situation of global marketization, the great three-volume work of the Spanish sociologist Manuel Castells in his magnum opus, The Information Age, Economy, Society and Culture, published between 1996 and 1998. And if you think my lecture is hard going, try reading this. The formal title of my lecture is Professions, Sacred and Profane, Reflections upon the Changing Nature of Professionalism. The argument of my paper is that professions and professionals have a crucial role in society, which is to speak truth to power. I'd like you all to remember that, because all of you, as university students, will have a responsibility to speak truth to power. Power generally doesn't want to hear truth, so you will need some moral courage to do that. It is your responsibility to speak truth to power. Now, this was one of the roles of the first professions in Europe of priesthood, medicine, and law. But today the evidence suggests that professionalism, modern professionalism, is being reduced in scope to the demonstration of technical expertise and efficient performativity only. Historically, you see, professionalism involved the demonstration of esoteric knowledge and expertise, but it also involved commitment to codes of moral, ethical, and social conduct. These commitments might, in certain circumstances, cause some professionals to be critical of or even oppose policies introduced by powerful authorities. This analysis will be developed in 3 sections. In section 1, the origins of the professions in the Middle Ages in the culture of the sacred, as Durkheim called it, will be examined. In section 2, the transition of professionalism from the culture of the sacred to the culture of the profane, as Durkheim called it, by the 19th century will be discussed with special reference to his classic text. In section 3, the contemporary situation of professionalism will be analysed with special reference to those professionals who work in the field of economics, finance, banking and business studies, and also those who work in the field of education. This section will focus on what can be called professionalism in the culture of global marketization. So let's begin then with section 1, which is professionals in the culture of the sacred. The very idea of a profession as a calling and not simply a job, and of professionalism as a process and a way of life, had its origins in religion, as Durkheim, although he was not a religious believer, but he saw historically that professions began in the culture of religion in Europe. Specifically in Europe, professionalism was formed in the religious culture and habitus established by the hegemony of the Catholic Church. Thus, the first professions of priesthood, medicine, and law were shaped by a social milieu which invested the technical activities of the practitioners with a spiritual, moral, ethical, and even on occasions, political significance. While under the jurisdiction and command of the temporal authorities of the time, such professionals had another allegiance, to the service of God and to revealed truth as taught by the Church. This was the concept of having a professional vocation. The priesthood existed to administer the sacraments and to witness to the truth. The physicians were called to continue the work of the great physician, and lawyers were called to administer the justice and mercy of God. Therefore, to be a professional in its historical origins was, at its best, and we have to admit it was not always at its best, but at its best, was to have a command of esoteric knowledge and competencies, but set within a moral framework of service to the common good, guided by the teachings of religious faith. The notion of having a calling gave to the early professions a relation to the sacred. Over time, professionals such as physicians and lawyers began to form associations and organizations which codified the moral principles which ought to regulate professional behavior. At another level, that of various merchants and traders, guilds were established to regulate economic activity. The culture of the sacred, as mediated by the Catholic Church, shaped these forms of regulation, involving concepts such as the sanctity of life, service for the common good, the just price, and the just wage. Now, as Nisbet has argued, the Enlightenment as a philosophical and cultural movement in 18th century Europe, with its questioning of traditional doctrines and values, and its emphasis upon individualism and the free use of reason marked the beginning of the end of the culture of the sacred as the dominant habitus in Europe. This major transition from a culture of the sacred to a culture of the profane, in which religion and ideas of a conscience collective were marginalized, and this provided an intellectual challenge for the French sociologist Émile Durkheim. What, he asked, would be the basis for social solidarity in the future? What sources of moral education and moral regulation could be found in the future? In this situation of potential anomie, he uses this term to refer to a situation of normlessness, Durkheim saw professions and professionalism in new forms as essential to the social order and stability of secular societies. His text, Professional Ethics and Civic Morals, is in fact a collection of Durkheim's lectures delivered at Bordeaux between 1890 and 1900, and the book first appeared in English in 1957. It is still regarded as a classic in its sociological, historical analysis of the development of professionalism. I turn now to section 2, Professionalism in the Culture of the Profane. In modern English discourse, the use of profane is often taken to mean that which treats something sacred in a hostile and abusive way. Durkheim used profane in a quite different way, i.e., in an objective and analytical sense, which referred to a major cultural change observable in Europe and particularly in France. This cultural change involved the end of the hegemony of the Catholic Church, of its Christian teachings and dogma, of the culture of the sacred which it sustained, and of its associated values and practices. In its place, Durkheim observed, especially in France, the development of a profane culture in which the dominant principles now were reason, individualism, enterprise, and relative personal autonomy. Religion had retreated from its central role as regulator of social, economic, and political life to a minor role as guide to some believers in their private lives. This newly established profound culture challenged Durkheim to consider in what ways social solidarity, social order, and forms of moral regulation of human behavior could be guaranteed in the future. The problem was, as Durkheim expressed it, very dramatically, we may say, I quote, "It is not possible for a social function to exist without moral discipline. Otherwise, nothing remains but individual appetites, and since they are by nature boundless and insatiable, if there is nothing to control them, they will not be able to control themselves." Now, he said that in the 19th century in France. If we look at the state of the world today, we can surely see that what he had to say at that time still applies very much to our present world conditions. Recognizing that the church could no longer be the regulator of social and economic activity, Durkheim came to the view that this role had passed to the secular state, which he accepted would have to be, I quote, "the organ of moral discipline in profane culture." However, an all-powerful state, like an all-powerful church, might become an oppressive force in society. Other social institutions were therefore required to achieve a balance, some balance of power. Institutions which in some senses could monitor the activities of the state. For Durkheim, these other social institutions would be found in the secular professional associations with their relative autonomy and codes of ethics. As Turner, a contributor to this book, puts it for Durkheim, I quote, "The real dislocation of modern society was the absence of intervening social institutions between the individual and the state. Occupational and professional associations were intended to fill this gap." So in this sense, professions and professionals had a potentially crucial political significance in society. In place of the church, which had on occasions resisted the power of kings in Europe, Durkheim believed that professional associations could provide a source of restraint upon secular governments in the future. Professions, with their associated codes of ethics, would also provide, in a secular mode, a continuation of moral education and moral regulation in the new cultural context. As Durkheim argued, I quote, "The professional group is by no means incapable of being in itself a moral sphere, since this was its character in the past. This morality and this form of regulation would find its justification in secular ethical reasoning, rather than in the religious precepts of an earlier age." But there remained a major problem to which Durkheim devoted the greater part of his analysis. This was the problem presented by the growth of capitalist enterprise in France and its associated financial and business practices. Whereas pre-capitalist enterprise and trading had been regulated by the guilds and by the church, these agencies were no longer a powerful element in modern society. Therefore, in the realm of capitalist enterprise and business relations, Durkheim perceived a moral vacuum. His book, Professional Ethics and Civic Morals, presents a powerful analysis and a critique of this situation, which has obvious relevance to many of our contemporary situations and challenges today. Of course, Durkheim's observations relate to the capitalist and business world of the 19th century, but the issues they raise challenge us to consider what has changed since his time. In this sense, he presents us with an agenda for contemporary research, analysis, and discussion, with statements such as this. I'm going to give you some quotes from his book. Think all the time that he was talking about 19th century capitalism in France, and we are now much more thinking about global capitalist marketization. But see if you can see a connection between what he said then and what faces us today. Here's the first quote. "This lack of organization in the business professions has one consequence of the greatest moment, which is that in this whole sphere of social life, that's business, trading, no professional ethics exist." You'll find that on page 9 of the book. Another quote, "This amoral character of economic life amounts to a public danger." You'll find that on page 12. Another quote, "Clearly, if there has been self-delusion to this degree among the classical economists, it is because the economic functions were studied as if they were an end in themselves without considering what further reaction they might have on the whole social order. Page 15. Last quotation. The more the markets expand, the greater the urgency of some regulation to put an end to this instability. Page 16. Within the 19th and early 20th century of the profane in Europe, Durkheim had great hopes that the established professions would provide a moral and ethical environment for society which would compensate for the loss of the power of the sacred in social and economic life. As Professor of Education and Sociology at the Sorbonne, he regarded the teaching profession as especially important in disseminating secular understandings of moral education in the schools of France. It could be said that for Durkheim, teachers were seen as a form of secular priests, of rational moral education, who would replace the former role undertaken by Catholic priests. Nevertheless, it seems likely that he knew that the work of the schools alone would not compensate for the economic anomie and anarchy which characterized the sphere of capitalist enterprise growing ever stronger in France. I turn now to Section 3, Professionals in the Culture of Global Marketization. If the great theorists of the transition from the culture of the sacred to the culture of profane, with its implications for the role of professionals, was Emile Durkheim, the leading contemporary theorist and empirical researcher of today's culture of global marketization is Manuel Castells. In his massive 3-volume studies of, the title is The Information Age, Economy, Society and Culture, published between 1996 and 1998. Castells has documented in detail the consequences of what he describes as the rise of the network society. Indeed, he dedicates the first volume of his analysis and gives it that title, The Rise of the Network Society. This provides an authoritative analysis of the economic, social, and cultural context of globalization, the context in which professionals of every category are now working. It is the context in which you are living and working and studying. It is the world which you will go out into that Castells is describing. So we need to understand him, and there's a lot of knowledge in those 3 volumes. So I have to quote at some length Castells' analysis. Here we go. This is a quote. A new economy has emerged in the last 2 decades on a worldwide scale. I call it, that's he calls it of course, I call it informational and global to identify its fundamental distinctive features. It is informational because the productivity and competitiveness of units or agents in this economy, be it firms, regions or nations, depend upon their capacity to generate, process and apply efficiently knowledge-based information. It is global because the core activities of production, consumption and circulation, as well as their components, capital, labor, raw materials, management, information, technology, markets, are organized on a global scale, and competition is played out in a global network of interaction. It has emerged in the last quarter of the 20th century because and he gives this capitals to emphasize its importance, information technology revolution provides the indispensable material basis for such a new economy. You'll find that on volume 1, page 66. Castells goes on to argue that the cultural, social and political consequences of this economic revolution are far-reaching. International competitiveness has emerged as a key dynamic in every society. I quote, "Together with the search for profitability as the driving motivation of the firm, the informational economy is also shaped by the vested interest of political institutions in fostering the competitiveness of those economies they are supposed to represent." Or to put it another way, every government in the world has to think constantly now about its position in global competitive marketization. The emphasis here, says Castells, is on the relative position of national economies vis-à-vis other countries as a major legitimating force for governments. In other words, he's saying the governments have to gain their success, make sure they're going to be elected next time, by showing how well the economy, shall we say, in Brazil is doing compared with the economy in Argentina or in Chile. And he concludes by saying, practically all countries have to steer their economies in cooperation and in competition with others. So we have to consider, what are the implications of all of this for professionals and professionalism in the culture of global marketization? Although Castells does not address this specific question, it seems clear from his analysis that there are many implications. For those professionals who work in the field of economics, finance, banking, and business management, a preoccupation with profit yields and competitive edge now becomes paramount over all other considerations. Durkheim in the 19th century had commented on the absence of professional ethics or of moral regulation in these spheres of activity. In the now intensified competitive conditions of global capitalism, notions of professional ethics and moral regulation can now be categorized as outmoded impediments to business derived from a vanished age. The real world. Always be careful when you hear that phrase. It's much used, because always say to yourself, whose real world are they talking about? They always give the impression there is only one real world, and it's the world they're talking about. This, of course, is not the case. However, the real world, as it is projected, of international business, it will be said, cannot be shackled by ideas of professional ethics or moral regulation, which originated in a long-forgotten culture of the sacred, or even a more recent culture of profane enlightenment and reason. Writing recently from a Catholic perspective, Edward Hadas, in a small publication called The Credit Crunch, Making Moral Sense of the Financial Crisis, this was published in 2009, comments on the recent world financial problems. I quote, "While only a few went so far as to endorse the slogan, 'Greed is good,' there was at one time an ideological movement to suggest that greed could be good, that it would be good, that it would add to progress and the competitive edge. But he says not many economists actually formally endorse that, but many economists did argue for and obtained lighter regulation of business activity and greater reliance on signals coming from the market. And then he notes one other factor may have played a role in the pre-crisis abdication of responsibility in finance, which of course we saw especially in USA, also we must say in this country, in Britain, and dramatically also in Ireland. And what was that factor? Well, says Haddis, it was the refusal to take morality seriously in any economic discussions. Economists pushed moral issues to the side. It was outside their sphere of interest, and what Haddis is saying is, well, if you do that, there's going to be a crisis. And we see today the crisis that has occurred. But these implications are not confined to the world of business only. Established professions such as medicine, law, and education, that's education both in higher education and in school education, are presented with ideological and political challenges to their professional ethics, values, and commitments to common good service. What we are witnessing in contemporary society, everywhere I would say, is an attempted market culture colonization of all forms of social service in order to sharpen the overall efficiency and competitive edge of the total social formation, the society, and not simply the sphere of business activity. And this is particularly apparent in the field of education. In his studies of the economic success of the so-called Asian tigers, Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, and Hong Kong, Castells argues that among other things, strong state development, by what he calls the developmental state, was apparent. This process of development involved transformations of educational systems to be more closely coupled to the needs of economic development. Educational institutions in those countries, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Singapore, were re-engineered to become service agencies for increasing the competitive edge of the economy. A similar development has been noted in this country, in the UK, by Stephen Ball, Professor of the Sociology of Education at this Institute of Education. In his research-based book called Education PLC, you understand he's suggesting that education itself, even the school and certainly the university, has become commercialized. So he's calling it PLC, meaning Public Limited Company. Ball concludes, I quote, "Within institutions, colleges, schools and universities, the means-end logic of education for economic competitiveness is transforming what were complex interpersonal processes of teaching, learning and research into a set of standardized and measurable projects." You'll find that on page 186 of his book. Teachers both at school level and in higher education who in previous decades have been regarded as professionals involved in the intellectual, cultural, social and moral development of children and young people are now being reconstructed as agents to service the economic needs of the competitive state. Ball argues, I quote, that education is spoken of within policy in terms of its economic value and its contribution to international market competitiveness, and a situation, he says, is developing in this country, in the UK, in which there will be, I quote, a thorough subordination of moral obligations to economic ones. In other words, it's the economic considerations that will trump everything else. You'll find that on page 185 of his book. Knowledge itself is being reconstructed as a commodity in the marketplace, which can be traded like any other commodity in the global economy. Now, all of these arguments by Professor Ball here at the Institute of Education in London had been anticipated by his predecessor at this institute, who actually was my doctoral supervisor, a very brilliant man, I have to say, Professor Basil Bernstein. In a prescient section of his text, Pedagogy, Symbolic Control and Identity, this was published in 1996, Bernstein argued as follows, I quote, "There is a new principle guiding the latest transition of capitalism. The principles of the market and its managers are more and more the managers of the policy and practices of education. Market relevance is becoming the key orientating criterion for the selection of discourses." He's referring here to the fact that the very language of education is being taken over in terms of a commercial language now, dominant. And he says this movement has profound implications from the primary school to the university. And then more powerfully still, he says this, "There is a new concept of knowledge. This new concept is a truly secular concept." So you see, we have come a long way from the culture of the sacred. We have knowledge now as a truly secular concept. And he says, knowledge should flow, or this is how it's understood, he does not agree with it, but this is how it is now understood in the world, knowledge should flow like money to wherever it can create advantage and profit. Indeed, knowledge is not like money, it is money. So knowledge is now divorced from persons, their commitments, their personal dedications. These become impediments. You'll find that on page 87 of his book. Now, in the culture of global marketization, Bernstein was warning professionals working in schools and universities that their professional commitments to the principles of a liberal and humane education were being devalued, and that their personal dedications in writing and research might be seen as impediments to higher education PLC or the university as a business corporation. So if the work of all these analysts, Castells, Hadas, Ball and Bernstein, is taken together, it amounts to a major challenge for the future of professionalism. Will professions lose their relative autonomy in the face of the insatiable demands of the global market economy, a situation in which there is no alternative? This is a phrase much used by people who want to see the global market economy develop. There is no alternative. In this country, it has a particular chilling memory for us because it was constantly used by our Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, who drove through very radical and, as many of us thought, brutal reforms, and always used this phrase, "There is no alternative." And of course there was. So, will professions lose their political role as part of the balance of power relations in society? What will become of professional ethics and professional moral regulation of activity if the very concepts of ethics and regulation are categorized as impediments to the maximization of profit? So the last section of this paper will attempt to address some of these questions. I now come to a subheading which I have named Professionals as Critics and conscience of society. I'm rather proud of the fact that I originated that phrase myself when I was Professor of Education in New Zealand, and I was asked to make a formal definition of a university for some official report. And I put down the usual things you would put down about a repository for traditional knowledge, the creation of new knowledge, undertaking original research, and so on. And right at the end, I thought, but there's something else. What is it? And then it came to me. A university has to do all those things, but it has to do more than that. It has to be also critic and conscience of society. I'm also very proud of the fact that my phrase was taken up in an official report in New Zealand, and even more pleased that the New Zealand Parliament legislated that no institution in New Zealand could call itself a university unless it engaged in some activities in the role critic and conscience of society. And I hope your university is doing that. Now, professionalism at its best has always attempted, as I said at the beginning of this lecture, to speak truth to power. It's a dangerous thing to do, of course, but it has to be done. At various historical periods, this truth, the idea of truth, has been based upon the truth of a revealed religion. That was in what we call the ages of faith, the culture of the sacred, or a secular truth based upon reason, scholarship, evidence, and research. Professionals have enjoyed a degree of relative autonomy from the demands of the state and the economy. This autonomy, which always had to be fought for, was granted in respect of the powerful knowledge and competencies which they possessed. And at their best, such professions sought to operate with codes of professional ethics and notions of moral regulation and service to the common good. However, as Durkheim observed, the world of capitalist enterprise generally operated outside of the sphere of professional ethics and moral regulation. And the problem is, this sphere has grown much larger since the time of Durkheim. Under the hegemony of the contemporary culture of global marketization, all categories of professionals and all forms of professionalism are faced with a radically changed environment. Global marketization has generated versions of the strong state, of what Castells called the developmental state, and of what Jessup calls the competition state. And the relative autonomy of professionals is likely to be reduced by the imperatives from the strong state. We had the experience of strong state action here in UK when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. And most of us did not like it. The second challenge arises from what I have called the attempted market colonization of all forms of social service, including education, health, and social welfare systems. Market culture in these arenas will have a detrimental effect upon practices of professional ethics and moral considerations. They are, after all, as the marketeers would say, impediments to progress. Current conditions, therefore, present professionals and professions with a test of occupational integrity. Either they will accept the role of being simply technical experts and efficient producers or deliverers of state-specified outcomes, or they will find the moral courage to maintain a role, where necessary, of being also critics and conscience of society. Bernstein concluded his analysis of contemporary changes in education by saying, I quote, "What is at stake is the very concept of education itself. You'll find that on page 88 of his book. And I must conclude by saying, in the light of the analysis presented here, what is at stake is the very concept of a profession itself. Thank you very much.